Good afternoon and welcome to Quest Club for April 17th, 2026. Thank you all for being here today. This is our last meeting for this Quest year, and I want to thank you for participating in the meetings this year. Thank you. We are now in the 93rd day of the year and have 271 days left in 2026. In this day in history, in 1892, the first Sunday National League Baseball game was held, and the Reds beat the Cards 5-1. Oh, I always like history. Now, today's invocation will be given by John Stafford.
When I was reviewing the guidelines to give a Quest Club invocation, two criteria really stood out. One, be reverent. Two, as much as possible, relate the invocation to the topic of the day. That's going to be a tough challenge today. So let's pause for a moment of reflection. As we gather for this final meeting of the year, we give thanks for the fellowship that brings the Quest Club together, year after year, generation after generation. We are grateful for the curiosity that drives us, the questions that challenge us, and the conversations that sharpen our understanding of the world. Let's also take time to share our appreciation to our fellow Questers who've contributed their time and talents to make this season, both our Friday presentations and our fall and spring parties, so enjoyable. To our Executive Director, Mark, to our officers, Al, Michael, and Steve, to the board and to the various committees that enable us to function. May we also take time to appreciate the work of each member who presented this year. The insights shared and the subsequent discussions generated have benefited each of us. Let us also be thankful that Questers continue to engage in the conversations following each paper in a spirit of mutual respect and civility, a trait which appears to be on the decline in the general society. As with topics such as today, let us appreciate our collective ability never to take ourselves too seriously. As we turn our attention to Mad Magazine, we celebrate a publication that has spent decades poking fun at authority, at tradition, and self-importance, which means it should feel right at home for us here at Quest. After all, is there any group that can appreciate, if there's any group that can appreciate satire, it is one that voluntarily reads 20-page papers aloud to each other for fun. As we close this season, let us continue to honor the traditions of the Quest Club while remaining open to new perspectives in the years ahead. Grant us clarity in our thinking, generosity in our listening, and wisdom in our judgments. May our shared pursuit of knowledge enrich not only our minds, but our community. We look with gratitude on the year behind us and hope for the years to come. May our friendships remain strong and our minds stay sharp.
Today's topic, the Satire of Mad Magazine, is presented by Chris Bandemer. Chris was born and raised in Fort Wayne. He has a BA from Hanover College and a JD from the University of Denver. Chris practices law in Fort Wayne. He's married, has one child, and he also has one dog. I'd like to say, please help me welcome Chris Bandemer.
Mad was a revelation. It was the first to tell us that the toys we were being sold were garbage, our teachers were phonies, our leaders were fools, and our religious counselors were hypocrites, and even our parents were lying to us about damn near everything. To Mad, nothing was off limits. By the 1960s, it was read by most American college students and almost half of the country's high school students. Mad eventually reached its peak annual sales in 1974, selling approximately 2.5 million monthly issues. The story of Mad Magazine and its usual gang of idiots starts not with its founders, William Gaines, but with his father, Max Gaines. In the early 1930s, Max and his wife were struggling to feed their two children, Elaine and William. Max had tried everything, from working in a munitions factory to producing ties emblazoned with the slogan, "We want beer." Things were so bad that the Gaines family eventually moved in with Max's mother-in-law while Max figured out how to make money. One day, while rummaging through the attic, Max found a stack of Sunday funnies. While absorbed in the stories, Max had an inspiration for a new business venture. Gaines approached Eastern Color Printing about reducing the size of the comics and publishing them as a small book that sold for 10 cents. The books were an instant success, yet Eastern fired Max without warning. Shortly after being fired, Max learned that McClure Syndicate had a pair of idle two-color printing presses. He struck a deal with McClure where Max could use the printing presses and would split 50% of the proceeds with McClure. Eventually, Gaines' operation expanded and he produced well-known comics such as Superman, The Flash, Hawkman, and Wonder Woman. Despite all this success, Max was unable to enjoy it. In August 27, 1947, Max Gaines, friend Sam Irwin, and Irwin's son were boating on Lake Placid when their boat was unexpectedly struck by another boat. While Max had enough time to throw Irwin's child to safety, Max was unable to save himself. In an instant, Max's son William, otherwise known as Bill, went from being a 25-year-old in his final year at NYU to running a comic book publishing company. Bill soon realized educational comics was $100,000 in the red. Bill finished school and eventually jumped into the comic business. Bill created new titles and took EC Comics in a new direction. By 1950, Bill changed the company name from Educational Comics to Entertaining Comics and adopted the motto, "A New Trend in Comic Books." By 1951, Gaines had pulled EC out of debt and was running a small yet profitable comic book publishing company. He was working with Al Felderstein and Harvey Kurtzman, producing a wide variety of science fiction, horror, suspense, and adventure comics, with titles such as Ants in Her Trance, Taint the Meat, It's the Humanity, Ooze in the Cellar, and Coffin Spell. Stories dealt with marital relations, family life, love triangles, crimes of twisted passion, murderous offspring, social inequality, misguided patriotism, and prejudice against African Americans, Jews, and Mexicans. In 1951, Kurtzman convinced Gaines to produce a satire magazine, one that would lampoon the comics themselves. The first 32-page issue of Mad reached newsstands in the summer of 1952. It contained 4 stories, all written by Kurtzman, and each spoofing a different EC comic. Initial sales were slow, but Mad quickly developed a following. By November 1952, just as things were looking up for EC Comics and Mad, Ladies' Home Journal ran an excerpt from a forthcoming book that would set the comic book publishing world on fire. The author, Frederick Wortham, was an influential liberal psychiatrist, director of a mental hygiene clinic in Bellevue. The doctor was ready to publish the results of 7 years of his observations of the ravages of comic books on youth, the fearsomely titled Seduction of the Innocent. Wortham's book was a scathing indictment of almost all dramatic comic books, but his main targets were horror and crime comics. He saw them as having a bad influence, a bad effect on literacy, and pointed to the dangers of such words as yow, arg, thunk, and blam. He cited case after case of children committing crimes, murders, injuries, and suicides, all after reading comics. He attacked superhero comics as well. Batman, he claimed, was having a homosexual relationship with Robin, and Wonder Woman was a perfect lesbian role model. It took a few years, but by 1954, publications such as Reader's Digest were warning against the evils of comic books, while communities and church groups began to sponsor comic book burnings. The city councils of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and Houston, Texas, passed ordinances banning crime and horror comics. The issue was taken seriously enough that in April of 1954, the hearings before the subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency of the Committee on the Judiciary opened at the Foley Square Federal Courthouse in Manhattan. With Wortham as the star witness, the hearings did not go well for the comic book publishers. With public sentiment turning against comic publishers, drastic action was needed. The comic book publishers then formed the Comics Code Authority. The CCA was headed by former Judge Charles F. Murphy and represented 90% of the industry. The code was ruthless. No Walking Dead or torture were allowed to be depicted, and only classic vampires, ghouls, and werewolves were to be shown. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions could not be presented in a way that created disrespect for established authority, and all lurid, unsavory, and gruesome illustrations would be eliminated. Evil could only be used to illuminate a moral issue. On your in your table, there's a copy of the actual Comic Code of Authority, if you want to take a look at it. Distributors agreed that only comic books displaying the seal of the code on their covers would reach wholesalers, newsstands, and drugstores. The CCA's regulations effectively neutered much of the EC lineup, just as EC was becoming a real success. The solution was to turn Mad from a comic into a slick magazine. The new Mad magazine, a 25-cent bi-monthly black and white magazine, appeared in early summer 1955. Because the new Mad was a magazine rather than a comic book, it had no problem at all with distributors or the CCA. Satire. At Mad, nothing is off limits. There are no sacred cows, not hippies, beatniks, advertising executives, movies, fame, the military-industrial complex, sex, pollution, politics, and the list goes on. Advertising. In the 1950s through the 1960s, the 1950s through the 1960s saw the U.S. GDP soar. The great unsolved problem of American business became selling products to a populace accustomed to live to Depression-era lives of frugality. Companies eager to maximize the potency of their advertising and packaging consulted psychologists to encourage consumers to buy products they knew they wanted. Researchers pinpointed hidden needs that consumers valued: emotional security, reassurance of worth, ego gratification, creative outlets, love objects, a sense of power, and immortality. These emotional tie-ins solved the company's problems of selling products like gasoline, cigarettes, and cosmetics that were virtually identical to those of their competitors. This was the opening for the wise guys at Mad, who were beginning to realize that there was more to poke fun at than other comics. Mad liked to focus on a single pretentious or ridiculous gimmick of an ad or ad campaign. Through the 60s and 70s, ad parodies at Mad continued to deflate the most ridiculous excesses of Madison Avenue. In doing so, Mad armed its readers with a crucial weapon against the onslaught of advertising: awareness. As one commentator pointed out, in virtually all situations, we still have a choice, and we cannot be too seriously manipulated if we know what is going on. When we learn to recognize the devices of the persuaders, we build up a recognition reflex. Over time, Mad began to phase out advertising parodies. According to former editor Nick Meglin, one of the biggest reasons for the change was a response to Mad itself. Bright young people who were Mad fans went on to careers in advertising and wrote funny ads that were satires of themselves, thus hard to parody. Because Mad took aim at advertisers, it refused to publish ads. It is unclear if advertising contributed such a small part of Mad's income that Gaines didn't care about the lost profits, but he didn't want to be beholden to advertisers. Gaines would tell 60 Minutes, "We long ago decided we couldn't take money from Pepsi-Cola and make fun of Coca-Cola." Language. In addition to parodying advertising, Mad was known for satirizing poetry and literature. Mad famously parodied a cool version of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a copy of which is on your table as well if you want to take a look at it. The one-page piece ran the old version in a column on the left and a line-by-line translation of the address on the right in what was then known as Bop Talk. An example of what they did was, 7 years ago, our old daddies came on in the scene with a new group, grooved in free kicks and hip to the jazz that all cats made it the same. Now we're all hung up in a crazy big hassle, diddling whether that group or any other group so grooved and so hip can keep on swinging. The Mad version was quite accurate in content, and the tendency is to compare each new sentence to the original, encouraging most readers to spend more time willingly studying the address than they ever would otherwise. Music. Despite the popularity of parodies, not everyone was a fan. In 1961, Mad published Sing Along with Mad, a book of 57 parodies of popular songs. The writers transformed such songs as I've Got You Under My Skin into I Swat You on the Skin, Hard on the Skin, and When They Begin, Beguine into When They Begin in the Machine, when they Bring in the Machine. In each case, the reader was advised that the song could be sung to the tune of the original composition's title. Following its publication, Mad was hit by a suit for copyright infringement for 27 of the 57 songs by music publishers, representing Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, and Richard Rodgers. In Berlin VEC Publications, the composers charged that the copyright owners had the exclusive right to make a parody version of their work. For the 25 takeoffs, the publishers claimed Mad was liable for $1 per song per magazine printed. Since over 1 million copies of Mad were printed, the publishers claimed Mad was liable for $25 million. The trial court ruled for Mad and established a legal precedent protecting parody known as the so-called Mad Magazine exception. The music publishers appealed to the Second Circuit Court, which ruled in Mad's favor. Plaintiffs appealed the decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, which refused the appeal without comment. Television. The power of movies and television is undeniable. They teach us how to think, dress, what to say, what to listen to, and what to buy. Mad talks back to these all-powerful icons, arguing with them, and exposes their imperfect mirrors. For years, the anchors of Mad have been lampoons on motion pictures and television programs. A movie parody also almost always begins the magazine, and a television parody usually falls on the last black and white page. While most people view television as an entertainment product, Mad writers remind us that the real product of television is not the program, but us, the viewers. And we are being sold to the actual consumers of television, the advertisers. Shows, movies, and radio programs were not written by writers, but by advertising executives with plots, or rather formulas, tailored to the products that sponsored the shows. As critical viewers and satirists, Mad writers were driven by the gut feeling that both movies and television programming had a strange lack of depth and portrayed a world that was far from what most viewers recognized as reality. As a result, editors, writers, and artists worked out a variety of formats to spoof both television and movies. There were short format sequences like Scenes We'd Like to See, spoofs at looking into the wallets of celebrities like Frank Sinatra. He had photos of himself in war movies and his draft decrement card. Elizabeth Taylor, a receipt for a wash and wear wedding gown. Howard Hughes, whose home address was listed as on an ID card as Texas, Las Vegas, the Bahamas, Nicaragua, a car parked somewhere in the Western Hemisphere, a treehouse in Brazil, and a summer home in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Mad also wrote longer stories based on a specific movie or television show. These allowed the writers to do a point-by-point, merciless dissection of the plot, characters, and acting, often including references and comparisons to other shows. These parodies revealed how each show fits into the cultural context of the time and how they were received by the smart alecks at Mad. Politics. At Mad, politics is always a gift that keeps on giving. While Mad's political satire may tend to favor a liberal point of view, the main targets are extremists of any stripe: the John Birch Society, the Ku Klux Klan, communism, unions, hippies, etc. Former editor of Mad, John Ficarra, said, We've been chastised regularly by some very conservative members of the writing staff that Mad has gone too far to the left. They just don't understand that Mad attacks whoever is in office. The more fanatical or more strident they get, the more our criticism heats up, because we always attack extremes. So So when they say we've gone too far to the left, it's because Republicans and conservatives have been in control. If Dukakis had won the election, we would do Dukakis jokes. One of the best examples of Mad's political satire was the 1960 issue. It hit newsstands the day after the presidential election, which showed President-elect John Kennedy on the cover. This was quite a feat, given that this issue was printed 4 weeks prior to the national election. A closer examination revealed that the flip side of the magazine bore the image of Richard Nixon. Each magazine had 2 covers. Both covers were emblazoned with banners proclaiming, "We were with you all the way." One of Mad's most recognizable features is the ongoing battle between two espionage agents. One dressed in white, the other in black, but they are otherwise identical and are known for their long beak-like heads and their white pupils and black sclera. The two are always at war with each other, using a variety of booby traps to inflict harm on each other. The strip is a parody of the political ideologies of the Cold War. The strip was created by Antonio Parias, a prolific cartoonist in Cuba known for his political satire. In 1956, Parias was given the Juan Gomez Award, recognizing him as the foremost cartoonist in Cuba. Originally a supporter of Fidel Castro, Parias eventually soured on Castro for muzzling the press. Eventually, Castro accused Parias of working for the CIA. On May 1, 1960, 3 days before Castro's government nationalized the last of the Cuban Free Press, Parias fled Cuba. Parias cryptically signed each strip on his first panel with a sequence of Morse code characters that spelled "by Prohias," which you can see right here. On his strip, Parias stated, "The sweetest revenge has been to turn Fidel's accusation of me as a spy into a money-making venture." The mascot. No report on Mad would be complete without addressing Mad's most famous character, Alfred E. Newman. Playboy has the rabbit, Esquire has Esky, the fat, dirty old man, and Mad has Alfred E. Newman. He's been described as the guardian gargoyle of Mad, a grinning nebbish, more mental defective than a lunatic. Alfred E. Newman was everything that parents prayed deep down their kids wouldn't turn into and feared they would. Newman is Mad's mascot and spokesman, having appeared on the cover of virtually every issue since 1955 and has been running for president each election since 1956. But he's best known for his motto, "What, me worry?" Despite being so widely recognized as the face of Mad, Alfred E. Newman's origins aren't as well known. Fans were known to write in claiming to know the origin, but by the late 1950s, Mad found itself embroiled in a series of copyright infringement charges for its use of Alfred E. Newman. By 1956, one of the cases, a claim by Helen Pratt Stuff regarding her late husband's copyright of The Original Optimist, as he was called, had moved through a lower court and reached the federal appellate court for New York. Harry Stuff's original copyright had been filed in 1914, and although the image had not been reprinted after 1920, his widow had renewed the copyright in 1941. Stuff had sold about 2,000 copies of a popular postcard of with Alfred E. Newman's face on it. And between 1941 and 1948, the widow had won 6 claims of infringement. Mad's attorneys went to work trying to prove that if the Stuffs had even once failed to protect the copyright, or if Mad could prove that the image existed prior to 1914, the widow's claim would be invalidated. Researchers found pictures prior to 1914 and pictures copyrighted by other publishers. By the time the case got underway, Mad's attorneys were able to prove that even though the Stuffs had won several cases, they had abandoned their copyright by not contesting every subsequent copyright of the boy's picture, and they also had no case based on originality since the picture had been in use prior to 1914. The court found that Harry Stuff had been most derelict in preventing others from infringing his copyright. Stuff appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to accept the case, and Mad established its right to its adopted mascot. Evidence from the case established that the face was a favorite of artists for well over 100 years. While many people claim to know Alfred's origin story, no story yet has satisfactorily established his origins. The earliest known reproductions are from the late 19th century, and representations have been found in England and Germany. Despite Alfred E. Newman's recognizability, Mad refused to commercialize the moronic character. As Gaines put it, there's no Alfred E. Newman beach towel, no hamburger, no candy bar. You will never see any of that junk. Maybe a watch if it ran backward. By the early 1990s, much of the staff had retired or died. Gaines died in 1992, and through layoffs and corporate restructuring, Mad became ingrained in a more traditional corporate structure. In 2001, the magazine broke its long-standing taboo and began running paid advertising. The last regular issue came out in April of 2018. In 2019, the magazine relocated to California. The first California issue was renumbered issue number 1. The California issues began to consist mostly of curated reprints and new covers and fold-ins, although some new articles are produced. Mad's demise coincided with the rise of such factors as cable television and the internet. In many ways, Mad's power was undone by its own success. What was subversive in the 1950s and 1960s was now commonplace. In 2009, the New York Times wrote, "Mad once defined American satire. Now it heckles from the margins as all of culture competes for trickster status." In conclusion, before Mad, there were funny papers which were calculated to make you smile or crack you up, but not to dangle you upside down and show you the sheer dim-witted lunacy of everything from advertising, politics, movies, television, books, celebrity, etc. As a cornerstone of American satire, counterculture, and humor, Mad helped shine a light on the absurdities of the power brokers at Madison Avenue, government officials, media, and anyone in power. Mad encouraged readers to question authority and conformity. Mad was punk rock before punk rock. Although Mad is no longer a regular fixture of mainstream satire, its DNA lives on in The Simpsons, The Daily Show, and The Onion. Mad influenced satirists, musicians, journalists, critics, and will continue to inform and inspire anyone who seeks to speak truth to power, thinks critically, and exposes the phonies and hypocrites that surround us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was super. Are there any questions? Okay, how many of you read Mad Magazine? Give you a hint.
My copy is still under the mattress.
Really great paper that brought back a lot of memories by all those raised hands indicating I got a lot of my educational knowledge from those satires of great novels. My question, it was really interesting to hear about the development of the Comics Code criteria, and I'm wondering if as you came to that realization, which was over 70 years ago, if you drew any corollaries to some of the similarities that seem to be occurring now in terms of educational books that are being banned, salacious material that is now under attack as well, that things, well, there's nothing new under the sun, perhaps.
No, I mean, it's kind of, it's cyclical, and, things swing one way and then they have to counterbalance, swing back. I mean, the CCA was also, similar to the movies. They had their code of things in movies that you couldn't and couldn't do. And so what surprised me, though, was that apparently there was a huge uproar about these crime comics, that people felt that they were so disruptive or would harm children in such a way that they had to create these things. It's just kind of blew my mind. I never thought of comics that way, but apparently in a different time, I don't know.
Do you think it was, could you tell if it was a small movement of very determined people who wanted to regulate, or was it a general feeling across the public that these terrible comics had to be reined in?
I got the sense that it was to some degree localized, but also there was a national movement because of this book. I mean, they held a Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing on it, and because of that, the comic book publishers were concerned that the federal government was going to take action, and that's why they formed the CCA, was to hopefully to get in front of it. So I have to assume that it was, that there was a movement afoot. It sounds like they squashed it, but it sounded like it was, gaining steam from, what I can tell. Yeah.
Excellent paper. And certainly I remember reading Mad Magazine, from the time that I was a small child. I was struck with your mentioning that the awareness of psychological research was being used increasingly in advertising, because I do recall reading Mad Magazine and suddenly realizing that something that seemed pretty normal on TV was pretty manipulative by the satire. And I would contrast that with people that also believe that psychological ideas are so powerful, they wish to just completely ban stuff, but then they would turn over all of the means of communications to advertising and the psychologists. So that people that wish to ban the things they don't like need to help express things we need to have more of, rather than just something other than that.
Yeah.
So.
Chris, so enjoyed that paper, and I could see your legal background bleeding through into it a little bit here and there. I can't help but think that people like Weird Al Yankovic probably got their grounding because of the legal case that you were talking about, and his ability to take Michael Jackson music and turn it into My Bologna or something like that. But I also recall growing up, we collected newspapers from the neighbors and turned them into the recycle yard for college fund money. And our next door neighbors were a little more progressive than my parents, but they were Mad Magazine subscribers, and I picked those out of the material that was going to go to the recycling bin. And you brought back some great memories of the Guru of Ours, the parody of the Wizard of Oz, and I recall All in the Family Fair being another one of their parodies. Great flood of memories coming back. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Chris, I want to do a shout out to the back cover of Mad Magazine, because that was always the one where you had to do the fold in
yes.
To see what the secret design was, right?
Yes.
Of course, I can't remember a single example of one of the fold-ins, but that was at least that. And you had to read the Spy versus Spy comics first, find all those, read those, then work your way down. But I also kind of wonder, from what your experience has been tracing Mad Magazine, of the Me Too's or the follow-ups or the other magazines that have maybe been inspired by Mad, like National Lampoon or The Onion, do you bump into anything that sort of said, that this is the rank order they come in, we start with Mad and the others fall out from there?
No, I didn't find anything that specifically stated in order, but all of those, the National Lampoon, The Onion, The Daily Show, or constant Simpsons are constantly mentioned over and over again. I would assume SNL writers and Mad TV writers as well. Anybody that is in that space, from everything that I read, all of those writers are all very inspired by Mad, and even, you know, I didn't include it. There's a quote in here about that I have in one of the books about, you know, Roger Ebert said that he got into critiquing films because of Mad Magazine. So, and I think maybe Patty Smythe, she was quoted as well. I mean, it just touched so many different areas of art and culture that it was hard to get away from.
Chris, you mentioned The Simpsons kind of carrying on a satire, and I was wondering if the originators of Mad had an influence on Norman Lear, which in the 70s began to do a lot of satire with All in the Family.
I didn't find anything specifically to Norman Lear, but I mean, you would have to assume that he or his writers were influenced by it because of the trajectory of that show and what the topics that they took on and tried to address. So you would have to assume that they were influenced in some way by it.
Great paper, Chris. I was an avid subscriber to Mad Magazine, read it cover to cover, every issue. One movie spoof that I remember, 2001, A Space Idiocy.
One more.
Chris, really enjoyed the paper.
Thank you.
Can you tell me, any chance you saw how much they cost now as collector's items? I know comic books are collector's items these days, and Mad Magazine was always more expensive than a regular comic book because it was thicker. I think it might have been 50 cents. That's showing my age.
I did not look into that, unfortunately. I would assume that there are certain, as with anything in the collectible world, there are certain issues that are revered by the collectors and are worth. If you don't follow it, an amount of money that you would say that's really too expensive, but if you follow it, you think, oh my gosh, I have to get my hands on it, and that's all they're charging. So I like I said, I assume there's some that are probably fairly expensive, but I don't know specifically.
Chris, one more question for you. The name Sergio Aragones, I think, comes to mind. And I'm recalling he was a major illustrator or cartoonist for the magazine. Did you run across the name, or did you have anything that you could share about him?
I've not seen that name. The names that came up all the time are there's Kurtzman, and of course I've forgotten them now. Kurtzman and Felderstein were the main writers and people who really followed Mad. They also had additional writers that they would hire to produce certain strips or whatever. And there's a long list of those illustrators as well as writers, but I didn't commit any of those to memory other than the two that really had a huge influence, which were the two that I just mentioned. So, thank you.